Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man has been performed by brass and percussion of the New York Philharmonic under the direction of the orchestra's Laureate conductor, Leonard Bernstein. Beginning today's concert, honoring a most uncommon American composer, Aaron Copland. And at the end of the fanfare, Mr. Bernstein turned and saluted Aaron Copland, who is sitting in the side tier area near the stage. In just a few moments, our concert will continue under the direction of the Philharmonic's music director, Zubin Mehta. He will conduct two rarely played, relatively short orchestral pieces that Copland wrote for radio broadcasts in the 1940s. The first, Letter from Home, was commissioned in 1944 by the American Broadcasting Company and band leader Paul Whiteman for Mr. Whiteman's Radio Hour. Copland's Letter from Home can be interpreted as reflecting a letter written by someone in a small American town to a GI overseas during World War II, or perhaps to a family member who had moved away because of war work. Its mood is nostalgic and folk-like. The second piece, John Henry, was composed in 1940 on a commission from the Columbia Broadcasting System. It is based on an American folk tune about the 19th century black railroad worker who, according to legend, entered into a grueling man versus machine contest with a newly invented steam hammer to lay railroad tracks. John Henry won the contest, but at the cost of his own life right after achieving the victory. Now, coming on stage is Zubin Mehta to conduct the first of two short orchestral pieces by Aaron Copland, Letter from Home. Letter from Home by Aaron Copland. Zubin Mehta conducted the New York Philharmonic. Mr. Mehta is remaining on the podium, and in just a moment he will conduct the next short orchestral piece by Copland, John Henry. Aaron Copland's orchestral ballad, John Henry, subtitled A Railroad Ballad for Orchestra, has been performed by the New York Philharmonic, Zubin Mehta conducting. Mr. Mehta performed the revised 1952 version. Aaron Copland's Letter from Home and John Henry have both been recorded under the composer's direction with the London Symphony Orchestra for CBS Masterworks. In just a few moments, following some rearrangement of the stage seating, today's New York Philharmonic broadcast concert, made possible throughout the United States by a grant from Exxon Corporation, will continue with Aaron Copland's Concerto for Piano and Orchestra. The soloist will be Bennett Lerner. Aaron Copland's Piano Concerto remains his most jazz-influenced work from the 1920s. But Copland has always insisted that it is not a jazz work, that he wouldn't know how to write a real jazz piece. But he readily acknowledges that it is indeed jazz-influenced, and that in the 1920s, he was one of many young composers who believed that the rhythms of jazz and the feeling of the blues were the most distinctive and unique elements of American music. Jazz elements, Copland has said, provided a way for young American composers to break away from the European derivations of most American concert music to that time. The premiere of Copland's Piano Concerto took place in 1926, 2 years after the premiere of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, and a year after the New York Symphony introduced Gershwin's Concerto in F. Copland, however, had written earlier jazz-influenced works, which have recently been recorded by the soloist we're about to hear in today's performance of the Piano Concerto, Bennett Lerner. Here is a brief conversation that I taped with Mr. Lerner about these pieces and the concerto itself. Bennett, it's fascinating to look back on the early music of Copland and see to what degree jazz is to be heard and felt in it.
Yes, Copland used jazz elements very much, although he has said to me once that he could never really write an authentic jazz piece. That means a series of chords with music improvised over it. But he did use jazz elements a lot. The Piano Concerto is one of his biggest jazz pieces. He wrote that much to the dismay of composers like Roy Harris, who were not happy to hear that Copland was writing jazz. And he wrote many other pieces using jazz. There's a piano piece which I've recorded called Sentimental Melody, which is made up of discards from the Piano Concerto. And the earliest piece dates from 1921, which is before Copland went to Paris to study with Nadia Boulanger. It's one of a set of pieces called Three Moods, or in French, Trois Esquisses, and it's called Jazzy. And he did, although he wrote it before going to Paris, he did play it in student recitals at Fontainebleau. And there's a letter in which he wrote home to his parents saying that he played a piece based on jazz melodies, which ought to make the old professors sit up and take notice.
I'm sure they did that, as our audience will do now as we hear it. It's called Jazzy?
Yes.
Jazzy by Aaron Copland, played by Bennett Lerner. Bennett, you have recorded so much music by American composers, and certainly Copland figures very prominently in that discography of yours. You've consciously gone out to do that, I presume.
Yes, that's right. I have now 2 records on the Etc. label. We call them American Piano Music Volumes 1 and 2, and they are the products of my research. They're mostly first recordings of pieces of composers such as Bernstein, Paul Bowles, Roy Harris. It also includes some large pieces by William Schuman, some pieces by Philip Ramey. And this has been, as I said, a product of research for a few years.
Back to Copland, the Piano Concerto in its early years, in fact, was called the Jazz Concerto. We seem to have dropped that nickname these days and simply call it Piano Concerto.
Yes.
But jazz really jumps out at one in the Piano Concerto.
Oh, it is a real jazz piece. Copland described the first movement as a blues and the second movement as a snappy number. But it's jazzy in another way, and it's something that I've coached the concerto with him quite a bit, and what he worked with me on was getting it to sound spontaneous, getting it to sound free in the way that jazz sounds. He said to me that the listener must not really be sure when the next notes are coming.
Well, I think we're almost ready to hear you, Zubin Mehta, and the New York Philharmonic play the Piano Concerto. Bennett, thanks so much for visiting.
Thank you.
And now, coming on stage, our pianist Bennett Lerner and conductor Zubin Mehta. In just a moment, with the New York Philharmonic, they'll perform Aaron Copland's Concerto for Piano and Orchestra. The Concerto for Piano and Orchestra by Aaron Copland has been performed by Bennett Lerner, soloist with the New York Philharmonic, Zubin Mehta conducting. And at the conclusion of the piece, Bennett Lerner, after shaking hands with Zubin Mehta and concertmaster Glenn Dicterow, Bennett Lerner turned to the side tier of seats here in Avery Fisher Hall and signaled to composer Aaron Copland, who is attending today's concert, and signaled Mr. Copland to rise and share the applause with him and Mr. Mehta. The New York Philharmonic has recorded Copland's piano concerto with the composer as soloist and with Leonard Bernstein conducting for CBS Masterworks. Bennett Lerner has recorded solo piano works by Copland as part of 2 albums of American piano music on the Etc. label. Once again, pianist Bennett Lerner has been recalled to the front of the stage, and once again, he has signaled to Aaron Copland, sitting in the audience, to share in the applause for this performance of Copland's piano concerto. Following the intermission, on the second part of today's full-length Exxon New York Philharmonic broadcast concert, Zubin Mehta will return to conduct Philip Ramey's orchestration of Copland's Proclamation, plus Prairie Journal, and Copland's revised version of his Symphony No. 1. Before we continue with this week's program, some words about future New York Philharmonic broadcasts, made possible throughout the United States 52 weeks a year by a grant from Exxon Corporation. Next week, Zubin Mehta will conduct Bruckner's 4th Symphony and Elgar's Cello Concerto, with Yo-Yo Ma as soloist. 2 weeks from today, we'll present a concert by the Philharmonic taped in Milan's famous La Scala Opera House. Zubin Mehta will conduct music by Mozart, Dvorak, Crumb, Ravel, and Verdi. 3 weeks from today, our concert will originate from Tel Aviv, Israel, and it will be a combined concert by the New York Philharmonic and the Israel Philharmonic, with Zubin Mehta conducting the combined forces in Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, and with Yitzhak Perlman as violin soloist in concertos by Mendelssohn and Bruch. We hope you'll join us for each of these programs. Now, we invite you to stay tuned for the second part of today's All Copland concert. During the intermission of today's final program in our season-long Copland retrospective, we're pleased to have as our guests 2 of America's best-known and most admired composers, who are also longtime friends and musical associates of Aaron Copland, Morton Gould and William Schuman. William Schuman, in addition to being a Pulitzer Prize-winning composer, was formerly president of the Juilliard School, and he was also the first president of Lincoln Center, a post he held for a decade. Morton Gould, in addition to the many works that he has composed for the concert hall, for Broadway, for radio, television, and motion pictures, has long been active as a conductor. And just recently, he was elected president of ASCAP, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. Let me ask both of you, looking back over the decades in which you've been active in music professionally, what kind of an influence has Aaron Copland been? First on music in general, and then on you yourself. Bill, let me direct that question to you first.
Well, it's a very easy question to answer, both generally and particularly, because Copland was sort of not just a father figure, he was a father. For example, he's 10 years my senior, and when I first met him, he was 35 and I was 25. Now, that doesn't seem much today when he's 85 and I'm 10 years his junior, but I assure you, at that age, it made a great, great difference. And he championed all the composers. I didn't study with him, but I could always bring him scores, and he'd give me the benefit of his advice. And just parenthetically, a few years ago when they were celebrating Copland's 80th birthday, they gave an all-day program up at the Symphony Space in New York, and some of Copland's close colleagues were asked to put on some of their own music. And a new song cycle of mine was sung. And there came Aaron down the aisle. He's now 80 and I'm 70. So at 35 and 25, he put his arms around me and said, "Bravo, my boy."
Morton, what is your reaction to the question, the influence on music generally and on you particularly?
Well, I feel pretty much the way Bill does. I think he's certainly been an influence musically on many of my colleagues and myself. I think, for one thing, he dealt, as we know, in a certain period with Americana, with the obvious influence of jazz, etc. He also had a way of writing that was very clear and had a clarity to it. During periods when some of the creative climate of music was very, very complicated. I'm not making value judgments on it, but I mean, Aaron sort of represented a sort of a flagship, so that as a creator, certainly he was an influence, and as a person, he was an influence. As Bill said, he was a father figure. I remember seeing Aaron, I must have been about 16 or 17, and at that time, he was older than I was, but he represented a senior musical citizen. And of course, my experience with Aaron is not only as a colleague, etc., but as a conductor. I've performed and recorded his music. So I feel a very close association.
Beginning with, I think it was Aaron's 70th birthday, his publisher would run a birthday party every 5 years, 70, 75, 80, and Bill, you were always the master of ceremonies for each of those.
It started in the 60s.
60s.
The 60th birthday, we gave a great festival of his work. I was president of the Juilliard at that time.
Yes.
And we gave an enormous 3 or 4 day festival with Copland's music. We had a party then in the 65th and 70th. Now, of course, we celebrate them at faster intervals, which is correct.
Mm.
I've had the feeling that part of my career has been celebrating Aaron's
Every
birthdays.
fifth-year
And
birthday.
yes, and rightly so.
Yes.
I mean, it's always been a pleasure to do that. But I think that it also shows how important he's been, how visible as well as audible he's been to our music.
Let me ask both of you, since you both, in addition to the remarkable lives you've had in what we, for lack of a better word, term classical or serious music, you've also had musical lives on the other side of the musical fence, the popular side. And in a sense, Aaron has been there too, but there aren't too many of our younger composers today who straddle both sides of the fence. How do you both feel about that?
Well, I can't answer for other composers, but it was such a natural thing for me, growing up in the city of New York, to be part of the popular music scene. I didn't know anything about serious music, so I had a dance band, and I wrote songs, very few of them which was successful, but that's beside the point. But just recently, I was working on a couple of pieces, and which I used some traditional dances, and I found that I needed a fragment for a waltz, and suddenly a phrase of a waltz that I wrote in a song with Frank Lesser 40 years ago, which was never put down on paper, came to my mind, and I wrote it down, and it's used in this symphonic piece and also in a chamber music piece. So I feel that those beginnings never really leave you, because they give you, at least they gave me, and I know others too, a sense of the American language, and the American language, for me anyway, very much forms my melodic content, and that goes back to popular music.
Morton, you're sitting there nodding your head in assent.
Yes, well, because I think Bill should also mention it, so I'm going to mention it for him. As an example, a piece like his American Festival Overture has street cries in it.
Yes.
It's
Begins with
street
one.
songs, really.
Yeah.
It begins with that, right, Bill?
Yes.
And the focus of the piece is on that. The so-called serious piece, and yet has the popular roots. And much of Bill's music has that, the way much of my music has that. Now, to answer your question, why about other composers? Well, it depends on the individual. I mean, there have always been composers who take many of their ideas from the vernacular, from speech, from the sounds around them. And those of us who do it very consciously. Not that we sit down to write a vernacular piece, but this is our natural instinct. There are other composers who don't use that at all. They walk away from it. Although it's interesting that I think if you scratch any piece of symphonic music, you might find at some levels some popular derivations or references. Because all music comes out of the human condition, it comes out of human expression, filtered through an intellectual process and through one's own particular gifts. Now, that's a very involved answer. What was the question?
I think you answered the question very well, both of you.
I just want to interrupt the flow to say one word about Aaron as a teacher, which we haven't said, if you don't mind my doing that.
Please.
The extraordinary thing about Aaron was he didn't try to make other composers little Aaron Coplands. He had an uncanny way of trying to understand what that particular composer was about and to help him reach his solution in his own terms, not in Copland terms. And that was very, very different from Hindemith, for example, who was a famous and wonderful teacher, but did turn out little Hindemiths. And Copland was quite conscious of the fact of trying to